Just before you listen to today's episode, this is a quick message to remind you that if you like what you hear, you can help support History Hack, which is run entirely by volunteers using our Patreon account. There are links on all of our episodes, or if a subscription is not your thing, you can also now drop us a line on Ko-fi, which is just the equivalent of buying us a drink. So if you hear an episode, you like it, and you want to chip in just once, then you can do that too. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. Zach here on presenting duties with Alex, mainly because when the others said, oh, I want in on this, I went, no, it's mine. We're doing Egypt, not having it. Boss, who have we got with us today?
You only do this because you love the Egyptian cartoons where you're like an Egyptian god.
Without any nipples.
Yeah, without any nipples. It's a power thing, isn't it? We have Julian Maxwell-Heath with us today. This is going to be so exciting. So he's an archaeologist and Egyptologist with a wealth of experience writing, digging and illustrating archaeology. He's authored books on both ancient Egypt and warfare in Neolithic Europe, but we're really excited to be talking to him today about his new book, which is Egypt Before the Pharaohs. Julian, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, so excited to talk about this. We both are. I know absolutely jack about this subject. So, and I love Egypt. I did the whole Nile thing. It's cool and amazing, and I can't wait to do all this stuff. So we are completely spoiled with ancient Egypt, aren't we? So to the extent that they don't even bother excavating most of the pyramids because there are so many and it would cost so much money. So for frame of reference, to go back before the pharaohs, is it right that we're looking at the Stone Age, and how much evidence is there?
Yeah, we're looking at the Stone Age, and in terms of evidence, we're looking at a hell of a lot. You know, there's the Western deserts and the Eastern deserts, but particularly the Western deserts is absolutely jam-packed with Stone Age archaeology. A lot of people aren't actually aware of it, which is, I suppose, understandable because of, you know, the spectacular nature of Pharaonic Egypt. The Stone Age archaeology gets overshadowed somewhat, but there's tons of sites, and some of it's amazing, absolutely amazing. I mean, obviously, there's nothing to compare to the pyramids, you know, things like that, but there's many, you know, some great sites, and like I said, it's not ignored as such, but it's overshadowed, you know, by ancient Egyptian civilization.
I mean, I think it really is ignored in terms of a tourist sense. So I did 10 days and I templed my arse off for 10 days and didn't even scratch the surface of the ancient Egyptian stuff. So trying to capture people's imagination with something that looks less shiny must be difficult.
It is. I mean, you can do like tourist trips to some of the decorated caves that still exist, but there's not much really, because a lot of it's scattered about on the surface, or it's not immediately visible as such. So there's not that much happens, you know, tourist wise. Like I said, there is sites you can go and see, but it doesn't. I suppose it appears somewhat primitive alongside, you know, ancient Egypt, which I think that's what puts people off a bit, which is a shame really, because there's loads of fascinating, you know, sites going back thousands of years. Yeah,
like you say, Alex, I think people are kind of seduced by the shiny gold stuff, Tutankhamun's mask, the Great Pyramids.
Definitely.
So, I mean, how far back can you go with this? So, to try and get people's head around it, Khufu's pyramid, that's 2,500 BC. So that's 4,500 years ago. We're going back way before the pharaohs, way before Khufu, because there's even a process in kind of that ends, if you like, almost with Khufu's pyramid. So how far back exactly can we go in terms of the evidence? How many years are we talking? And who were the first Egyptians, and what evidence is there of their lives, how they lived, what they did?
Right. The earliest sort of firmly dated sites date to around 400,000 to 300,000 years ago. Now, there has been a stone hand axe was found in the cliffs opposite Abu Simbel. Now, that's been dated by the sediments it was found in to about 700,000 years ago. And we can't really say for sure who the first Egyptians were, but most sort of archaeologists think it was Homo erectus, the early human species. But they emerged in sort of the Rift Valley of Africa about 1.75 million years ago, at least 1.75 million years ago. So they're associated with what's called Acheulean hand axes, which are like a distinctive pear-shaped stone hand axe. Now they're found in the thousands throughout Egypt, particularly in the deserts. But the question is where they here, before the 700,000 sort of like benchmark we got for that stone axe. And also we've got what's called the older one tradition, which that's also from sub-Saharan Africa. Now that was recognized in Olduvai Gorge by Lewis and Mary Leakey. And that's 5 million years ago. And it was associated with early hominid species. And there has been claims that older one tools have been found in Egypt, near Luxor and Cairo. But a lot of archaeologists have said that, have claimed that these are natural river rolled cobbles. And it's never been proven that the older one exists. But if you think that, say 2 million years ago, there was early, humans in sub-Saharan Africa, the likelihood that they might have moved north into Egypt is, it's quite possible.
This is the thing, isn't it? If humans came out of Africa, then they come through Egypt. Yeah.
And there's actually a site in the Republic of Georgia in the former Soviet Union called Dmanisi, and they found early Homo erectus remains there, which dates about 1.8 million years ago. So some archaeologists are of the opinion that Homo erectus emerged in Europe and then moved into Africa. Who knows? Because that's that field of archaeology. There's new finds all the time, and they're constantly arguing with each other about what was the earliest human species or not. But
they have punch-ups at conferences and stuff.
Yeah. Personally, myself, I think this hand axe that I mentioned 700,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I think there must be stuff before that, but whether we ever find it, that's a different matter. Because it's going so far back that it's probably been either washed away or it's buried, under the Nile floods. But you never know. One day, we might find something that, earlier than the Homo erectus. So far, there's been no remains found of early hominids, just the hand axes. So it's like, circumstantial evidence, really. Yeah.
And presumably the landscape's very different back then. I mean, we talked already about deserts and so on, but they weren't deserts back then, which is why people were living there.
I think the best way to envisage the deserts is to look at them like the African savanna landscapes, with the grasslands, and the trees sort of sparsely spread out, but, with little lakes and pools and rivers. I mean, obviously, otherwise they couldn't have lived there. It's well known that that's what the landscape would have looked like. So, and it dried up about, I think it started to dry up about 6,000 years ago. So then obviously people started moving into the Nile Valley and the Delta.
Talking about moving the story onwards, so you've got a pinpoint for the older stuff you found.
Yeah.
There's been some really interesting work that you covered in your book that's been carried out by Belgium University that moves the story forward, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's the Belgium Middle Egypt Prehistoric project, which Leuven University, and it was led by Pierre Vermeersch. I think he might have retired now, but I think the project's still going. And they've found loads of sites along the fringes of the Nile Valley, roughly dating from about 250,000 to 50,000 years ago. In fact, actually to about 24,000 years ago. So you're talking a huge, span of time that covers sort of the upper Paleolithic and the middle Paleolithic. So you're talking hundreds of thousands of years, really. And a lot of the sites they found are actually quarries, where people were quarrying chert cobbles, which they turn into stone tools. And they were probably producing them on site as well. And then these stone tools would be moved on to settlements, which haven't been identified, and they probably never will be, because they'll be buried under the Nile mud. If you think how many Nile floods there's been over the centuries, the chances of finding settlements from that time, are really slim. But again, you never know. I think one of the most famous sites was called Taramsa 1, which is located near Dendera Temple Complex. I don't know if you've been there.
No, I didn't do that.
It's a famous site. It's a famous, ancient Egyptian monument.
Yeah.
And it was basically a quarrying site, and there's all pits and trenches where they've been digging down to get the church cobbles. But the most important discovery was they found the skeleton of a young girl aged about 8 to 9 years old, and a body being placed in a seated position in a pit, and she was like leaning backwards with her face looking towards the sky. It was quite a poignant burial, really. And it's an important burial as well, because there's been very few, burials from this time found, in Africa, basically, the whole of Africa. So we don't know how she died.
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Because a skeleton was quite badly preserved. But they think she was buried in the Middle Paleolithic originally, about 50,000 years ago. But it's since been sort of confirmed that she was buried about 26,000 years ago. But it's quite amazing that she still survived to be found. But I think what I like about it is that her face was pointing up towards the sky.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was just like a chance of, it wasn't just a chance thing. I think it's been deliberately. She'd been buried like that. Why she was looking towards the sky, I don't know, but something to do with gods maybe, or but really interesting burial. And they've done another site they've done is called Nazlet Keita 4. Now this site has produced some of the earliest evidence for underground mining in the world. And it goes back to about 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. And what the people who dug here, they dug like quite a sophisticated network of ditches and vertical shafts. And there was underground galleries as well, and passages. Some of them like extending about 10 to 15 meters underground. And they can't have been nice places to work in. It must have been really hot, and oppressive, and probably quite dangerous as well. And in fact, they found the remains of wooden roof supports still in the galleries. And they found that some of the roofs had collapsed as well. But it's unlikely that anyone was killed. They think that the roof collapses occurred at a much later date. But again, they want to be nice places to work. And what happened was, shortly after they dug this site, they found 2 burials of 2 young men. One of the skeletons was like in quite a bad state, but the other one was really well preserved. And I think it's the best preserved skeleton from Africa from this date, from this period, from the Paleolithic time. And his skeleton was analysed afterwards, and what they found was that he'd been involved in hard manual labour.
Yeah.
Right, and so he was very close to the mine. We can't prove that he worked there, but the chances are his burial was around the same date that the mine was being worked as well. So chances are he was actually, he worked in that mine most of his life. And some people have suggested, maybe a bit sensationally, that he was a slave and he'd been worked to death in the mine. But whatever he'd done, he'd had a hard life. So
it's incredible that you can tell how someone that old spent
their
life.
Yeah, I know. So that's the chat. And also, actually, should point out that you have buried in his grave was a small stone axe.
Yeah.
And they found the same axes on the site, the quarrying site, the mining site. So all the evidence sort of points towards, he did work there. And whether he was a slave or not, I don't know. You can't prove that.
How old was he when he died? Like they say that they can tell he spent his whole life working. But...
Well, if you just said a young adult male, I think he was about 20 to 25. Now, if you think at the time, that was probably quite old at the time. Like if you reach 40, I suppose in like a lot of prehistoric societies, reaching 40 or above, you would have been, a really good age. So but that's a fascinating site. But they like I said, I think they're still going. The Belgian project, and Pierre Vermeersch, he's like really contributed loads to Stone Age archaeology in Egypt. He's like one of the top guys. But I think he's retired now, although he's still obviously active, in academia.
So we've talked about tools, but what about the culture? When do we see things like art starting to emerge, and what does it kind of look like? What evidence do we have of it?
Right, the oldest art. This is quite a recent find, actually. There's near a village called Kerta, which is in the Upper Egypt. Now, in the sandstone cliffs that border the Nile by the river, by the village, they found these carvings. They found carvings basically of animals, a lot of animals such as wild cattle, gazelle, hippos, various water birds, hartebeest, things like that. Now, when it was first found, it wasn't really it wasn't ignored, but it was just like they gave it a little footnote in it in like an academic journal. And then just recently, I think again, it might have been the Belgium project, went back to investigate it. And what they found was, this is what I found really fascinating, is that some of the wild cattle engravings, and there's also headless human figures engravings. And what they found was that these are very, very similar to wild cattle and headless humans that are seen in the upper Paleolithic caves, like Lascaux and Altamira in Spain. You know, the Ice Age caves where they're amazing painted arses. So it's quite amazing, actually. I mean, again, we can't prove that maybe people in Europe were in contact with people in Egypt during this time. But if you look at the similarities between the two, from the Ice Age caves in Europe and these carvings in Kerta, they are really very similar. So it's intriguing. You know, it could just be coincidence, but it's an interesting thought, because I think sometimes that we sort of discredit like prehistoric people. You know, they couldn't have travelled, they couldn't have made a boat. That's ridiculous. How could they have got that far? You know, and it's sort of it's a bit unfair to them, because it's like, it's that old, you know, they're just primitive savages sort of thing, when they were actually, you know, probably sophisticated people, and they could well have travelled to Europe. You know,
historians don't like coincidences. I'm watching Alex's face as you're saying, well, maybe it's coincidence, and we're both kind of having the same thing of, yeah, but is it though?
I know, yeah, but I mean, like, archaeologists don't like to say, like, you know, well, yeah, that's you know, people from, you know, Europe have travelled to Africa, and or vice versa.
Say that, but
they always hedge the bets.
Somewhere, an archaeologist got very excited.
Oh yeah,
found the second lot of pictures, didn't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating site, and they recently dated it actually by there was a deposit of sand against some of the carvings. So what they did is they dated the sand, and the date come out roughly about, I think, 17,000 years ago, 19,000 years ago, something like that. But of course, that's sort of like the latest date. So we don't really know how old the carvings are, but they've got to be older than the deposit of sand. So they could be as old as 25,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago, because they can't actually date the rock. So, you know, they dated the sand.
Yeah.
It's that old sort of archaeological thing, is that like if the coin's above a layer, well, the layer below must be, you know, must be older. But it's a fascinating site. And they think
sorry, carry on.
They think it was probably, I mean, why they carved the art into the rocks, you know, that's another question. That's probably to do with good old ritual, you know. But it would have been where it was located at the time, of course, you know, it would have been more, there would have been a lot more greenery and water, and so they think it was like a hunting site, where they'd lie in wait for the various animals that they were hunting, and by carving it's the old hunting magic theory that they've said for the Ice Age art. By carving the animals into the rocks, they were somehow, you know, helping themselves to hunt them. That theory's fallen out of favour in recent years, but it's a theory I like, actually. I think it's a good theory.
It's nice and romantic, but really, were they just bored? Is it like doodling while you're on the phone?
Well, I suppose they could have been, but I mean,
waiting for an animal to show up.
I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's possible. Yeah. I mean, but the headless figures are strange as well.
Yeah. I've never heard of those before.
No, there's a site called Gonnersdorf in Germany, and actually the similarities between the two are actually quite remarkable. It's like, whoa, you know, they're like females without heads, basically, and it's like, that's just strange. It's a strange coincidence. So, but who knows?
So you can just guarantee that Alex is going to want to Google like headless art figures.
Gonnersdorf.
Is he doing it?
Yeah.
As we speak. It's not going to be as scary as earlier on when we were recording on Disney, and it was the rabbit, Oswald the rabbit, that's just Mickey Mouse with stretched ears.
Oh, right, yeah. Got to mention there's a site called El Hosh as well. This is interesting. Again, it's later than Cater. It's from sort of about 9,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. And what they found there is these strange sort of abstract carvings, but some of them look very much like fish traps that are still used in Egypt today on some parts of the coast. I think on the coast of the Eastern Desert, sort of along the Red Sea, and they're very similar. So these are probably hunter-gatherers, or they're all hunter-gatherers, but why they were carving them, like Alex said, maybe they were just bored.
Well, I'm looking at these carvings of these women carving it up so Zach can see it, and I'm telling you now, they're proportioning with the absolutely massive knockers. I'm telling you, a man carved them.
Yeah, a pair. Yeah, they're famous, yeah. But the ones I'm talking about are actually the carvings and engravings in the rock. Yeah. I think they made figurines as well, but they're the famous Venus figurines. Yeah. So, and I should mention the cave of the swimmers. I've got to mention that's another one I forgot. You've seen The English Patient?
Yes.
Yeah, and you remember the scene where he goes in the cave. Well, Ray Fiennes goes in the cave with his torch and he finds all the amazing paintings. And I think Kristen Scott Thomas dies in the cave. I saw it a long time ago. I can't remember, but
it's been a while.
But anyway, that scene is based on, actually, it's based on a guy called Count Laszlo de Almaty. He was a Hungarian explorer, desert explorer, and he found this cave in, I think, 1933. And it's got all these weird, like, swimming figures and these, like, just animals and headless beasts and things on it. And in the film, Ray Fiennes is shown discovering it. It's a big dark cave, all spooky. But in reality, it's just a rock shelter. The real site is just a rock shelter. But the paintings are amazing. These swimming figures, they're all in a line. I think there's about 20 of them, and they're swimming towards this weird headless beast. It's an animal of some sort, but it's got no head, and they're all sort of. It's almost like they're going into its bum. It's a strange thing, and this type of art is hard to date, but they reckon they think it's about 6,000 to 4,000 years ago when you had the early sort of Neolithic people in the desert, and again, you just got to speculate what it was. But I mean, personally, there's a long history of caves being used as sacred sites, throughout the world, from ancient times. Even today, some caves are still sacred to, native peoples. So I think, when you find stuff like that, I think it probably did have a religious sort of, aspect to it, rather than, like you said before, it could have just been bored or you want to show off, Yeah, and there's one cave called the Cave of Beasts as well, which is it's a similar time, but rather than swimmers, it's got all these. I think it's got about 20 of these headless beasts in it, and there's some Egyptologists that sort of say that this art was like it formed the foundation for later pharaonic art. As people moved into the Nile Valley when the desert started drying up, and it's a nice idea. But if it was carved, painted 6,000 years ago, it would have the actual sort of idea would have had to have lasted another 3,000 years, because that's when ancient Egypt emerged, basically, 3,000 BC. But who knows? It could well have been. The ancestors of these people carried on this tradition, and some of the ideology that was inherent in it was kept going. In ancient Egypt. And sorry, I'm rabbiting on about art.
Oh, brilliant.
I'm not sure whether you call it art, but there's a Neolithic site from about 5,000 BC called Merimdi Beni Salama, and there's this really quite spooky clay head. It's only about 10 centimeters, in length, and it's just this weird face. It's this spooky, eerie face, and it's got a little hole in the bottom of it, and they think it was probably put on a pole and maybe paraded around or something. But it could have just been a child's puppet or toy, but you don't know. But try, if you can, try and Google it and take a look at it, because in fact, it's the image on the front of the book.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
But I find it's amazing. It's spooky.
I commandeered the book to do the prep for the episode and wouldn't share it, but I am posting it on to Zach because I know.
Yeah. Have you read it then?
Yeah, it's brilliant. I love it.
Oh, cheers. Good.
Totally obsessed with the Middle East.
You didn't find it too dense or dry, or?
No, not at all. And I'm not an archaeologist, so
I understood. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Cool.
See, on the subject of Alex prepping the notes, all that I've got to go on in this next bit is ask him about megaliths. So,
one of my favourite
subjects.
Megaliths. Megaliths are basically big stones, right? You've all heard of like megalithic tombs that you get, like, say, in Britain and in Europe. And megalith comes from ancient Greek. You've got megas, which is great, and then lithos, which means stone. So these megalithic tombs that we know, and it's a term that's used sort of quite, because you might have a small stone circle, and you wouldn't exactly go, wow, look at the size of those stones, but it's still called a megalith. Think of Stonehenge, that's the ultimate, megalith.
And they've got them as well, haven't they?
They've got, there's a few there's a few megaliths, but nothing to compare to Western Europe. There's a few stone circles, and there's what I think is a cow sculpture, but we'll come to that later on, I think. Yeah, but that's basically what it is. It just means big stone, really. That's it.
I'm going to make Zach really excited now, because Zach, I was going to ask you about tombs, but specifically there's a war cemetery.
Oh yes.
Oh dear.
They're both military historians, so it's like
one of my favorites. That's Jebel Sahaba, which is that's an amazing site. That is now in modern day Sudan, just over the border, but at the time it was, I can't remember the name of the sort of the culture they've assigned it to, but it sort of went from Sudan up to halfway up the Nile Valley, and that was found by Fred Wendorf, who's a famous American. He died not so long ago, but he was, out of all the people who've worked in like Stone Age Egypt, it was probably him who's done the most to uncover the evidence from that time. And Jebel Sahaba was, I'm interested in prehistoric warfare, so to me it's just a fascinating site. About 40% of the people buried there died violently. And some Egyptologists have sort of said, well, they might not have all died at the same time. Okay, that's fair enough. But either way, it was obviously wasn't this peaceful utopia that some archaeologists like to paint, like sort of prehistoric period as. All of that's changing now, to be honest, mainly because of a book called Before Civilization by Lawrence Keeley, who was an American archaeologist. It still is, I think he's still alive. I think he wrote it in about 1990. And he basically argued that archaeologists have been like pacifying the past for a long time, sort of since the 1960s onwards. They'd mention warfare and stuff, but it'd just be like in passing, oh yeah, there's a sword found, or oh, that was a hill fort. But they didn't take into the account the fact that, warfare would have impacted on people, just as it does now. But that's changed now. It's been recognized that, prehistoric people weren't these peace-loving, hippie types who, there's violence then, just as there is now. People had disputes and squabbles, and sometimes they spiraled out of control into, full-blown. And whether the Jebel Sahaba was that, we don't know. But like I said, it certainly shows that, it wasn't always peace and light at that time. The people were getting into serious bother with each other.
So the people that are buried there, are they all men, or are they a mix? Or
it was a mixture. It was men, women, and children. And I think actually, like thinking that most of them were women and children.
It'd be fascinating to know, wouldn't it? Like whether or not that is the result of like a prolonged war, or if that's just a standard cemetery, and that 40% is the average amount of people that came to grief then.
that's what I find fascinating. Was it a single event? Because when you go back to that time, you can't get exact radiocarbon dates on the skeletons and things. You just get a rough.
Yeah.
It's quite a good date, but it's not an exact date. So was it like a massacre event that they found those in Europe, sites in Europe, or was it a prolonged where people get killed every couple of years and then buried in the cemetery? But again, it shows that it was violent. Living then, you could be it could be dangerous at times.
Well, it shouldn't really come as a shock to us. I mean, it surprised me that this thing that you're saying about that tendency to sort of pacify ancient history kind of shocked me, because I mean this is getting a little bit kind of philosophical and almost kind of Radio 4 here, but there's something about humans and one-upmanship, and we're always trying to outcompete others. So that's not going to have changed fundamentally.
Exactly. I totally 100% agree. There's always going to be people who are out for themselves, and they won't stop at anything, to gain wealth or positions of power. I don't
quick, Zach, make a knob joke, quick, before we go to Radio 4. Right. Well, that's not.
Are we back to like cartoon drawings of my nipples again?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's it. Go back.
So that's it. Yeah, that's I think that's one of my favorite all-time sites. Actually.
Yeah, I got so excited. Really.
Yeah, I think when it was first discovered, it started changing perceptions. About prehistory. It's always brought up as like, well, they weren't so peaceful, were they? Because look at that. And then they sort of, I love the way some archaeologists, they talk about, they don't say warfare, they say intercommunal conflict, or, something like, it's warfare. The people are killing each other. That's not warfare. I mean,
The very definition.
Yeah, and intra-group competition and all this type of stuff. And, it's just people fighting with each other like they always have done, and they always will do, unfortunately.
So from now on, Alex, you're only allowed to refer to your period of specialism as the first global intercommunal conflict.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, definitely sounds way more exciting than First World War, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
But that's not the only evidence in pre-Pharaonic Egypt, is it, of violence and warfare?
No,
particularly about the skeletons at Hierakonpolis.
Yeah, do you mean the ones that had the scalping marks on them?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a fascinating. But before I'll talk about that in a minute, but I'll mention a few other examples.
Yeah, go for it.
In the British Museum, now I don't know whether he's still there. There was some people found it creepy. There was a burial called Gabolai Man, and it was from the Carter period, so it goes like 4,000 BC to 3,000 BC basically, and he'd been buried in like a pit grave, simple pit grave in the sand, and his body's been preserved. Have you seen pictures of the Iceman that they found up in the Alps? The Odyssey, it looks a bit like that. It's sort of he's all shriveled and dried up, but it's still quite well preserved. He used to be called Ginger because he's got ginger hair sticking still out of his skull. Now that's sort of people like, oh no, you can't. That's disrespectful. So he's no longer called Ginger.
I don't think he cares really anymore.
Exactly, he's dead. He's dead, isn't he?
I think he'd probably be quite chuffed to know that he's the centre of attention.
Well, that's just a bit silly, isn't it? But now they call him Gabolai Man A or something.
In this room, that's not remotely creepy.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. History hack. So.
But he was discovered by a guy called Wallace Budge, who I think was the keeper in the British Museum in the late 19th century.
You mean discovered or stolen by?
Well, yeah, I'd go for the latter actually. Going back, the way in the 19th century, the way they were basically just raping Egypt, weren't they? But to be fair, the Egyptian government weren't really bothered at that time. They were going, yeah, you can have it, yeah, it's fine, take it, But like you said, it was robbery basically. But anyway, he was found, I think, about 1890, something like that. But in 2012, they did a CAT scan on him. I think it was the hospital in London. I can't remember which hospital it was, but anyway, they did a CAT scan and they found in his back a stab wound. And that it probably pierced his lung or his heart, can't remember which. It was either from a copper or a stone dagger. So that was like, you're talking all those years later, they discover this guy was actually probably, someone jumped him basically, stabbed him in the back. And
it's amazing that you can tell that.
Yeah. But I suppose to be fair, back in those days, they didn't have the technology, wasn't advanced to look at things like this. But just to sort of go off track a bit, but I just mentioned Otzi, the Iceman. And this always amazes me. That guy, the ice mummy, he's been studied for when did he get found? Oh, years ago now. Must be 20 years ago, not more. And he's been studying for years, and it took them 10 years to discover that he'd been killed by an arrow that was lodged in his body. There's all these theories that he was a hunter up in the Alps, and he slipped and banged his head, or he's caught out in the storm. No, he was running from trouble. He had an arrow in him. He had cut marks on his hands. Had other injuries I can't remember exactly, but it took him 10 years to find that. There's this arrow. They found it on an X-ray. Amazing. I don't know how they missed it.
Zach's face is like, how can you not see an arrow?
Hey, I sacked the X-ray person.
Isn't like X-ray the first, because X-rays have been around long enough, 20 years ago they had X-rays. I know it's quite a kind of a modern thing to do full CTs and MRIs.
Like how the hell did they miss it? It's amazing.
We've been X-raying arts for heaven's sake.
I know. Yeah. And okay, right. I was going off track there, wasn't I? But there's another guy who's called Wadi Kubanaya Man, and he's from about 20,000 years ago. Now he was found. He had fragments of a stone spear embedded still in his bones, and then he had part of a stone projectile embedded in his upper arm bone. So obviously he met a grisly end. Again, it's this hunter-gatherers thing, to say, oh, they're peaceful, they're egalitarian, they don't fight. Well, stuff like that proves that they do at times, And to go back to the higher accomplice skeletons, now there's 21 skeletons found, and all of them displayed either evidence of decapitation or scalping. Now, what that means is that the archaeologists give it the old, oh, that's just a ritual. Or is it something more, sinister? Were they sacrificed? Were they war victims? Had they been, attacked? Had been an attack on the settlement? There's a young woman found as well, and she had a massive blow to her skull, and she obviously died from it. It hadn't healed. But the scalping is, as horrible as it is, it's fascinating to think that it goes back that far. Like the Native Americans did it, and it must be said some of the white Europeans took up the practice as well. In sort of the early pioneer days in America, there was a gang called the Glancing Gang who went around scalping people. But I think it was the Native Americans who's first sort of took up the practice, should we say? But there's actually quite a bit of evidence for scalping throughout Europe, actually, going back to Neolithic, maybe even the Mesolithic period. It's horrible to think that it went on, but judging from that evidence, it did. I mean, why would you scalp someone as part of a ritual? I mean, it might have been, you're an enemy and I've scalped you, but to get someone as part of your community and scalp them, that's a different matter, I think. So
because it's not it's not pleasant.
No, and there's also we've got sort of from the Neolithic period and the Carter period. It's like iconographic sort of stuff on pottery. You've got images of like you'll have two tall figures. Either side of them will be these smaller figures, and the tall figures have got their hands raised. The smaller figures have got what looks like ropes around their necks. If you think of like the like the pictures you see of slaves and they've got chains around your neck, or they did that in the Iron Age as well. They put these collars around the necks, and they think it's scenes of like some sort of military victory. But of course, with stuff like that, it could be, mythological, I suppose, or it doesn't necessarily. But again, that period, sort of 4,000 to 3,000 BC, when that was like the forerunner to the ancient Egyptian civilization. I think there was probably quite a lot of warfare going on there, quite a lot of fighting going on, because there's a lot of people sort of jockeying for power, I think. They settled in the Nile Valley, and like I said before, there's always people who try and take advantage of wealth or positions of power. So, and no doubt in the future they'll find more evidence. I mean, the evidence is growing throughout the world, I think, for prehistoric warfare being. I think it's widely accepted now that the prehistoric world was a lot more violent than we used to like to propose.
A bit bonkers that actually they ever got away with trying to claim that there was a time when people weren't arseholes, basically, because it's just it's human nature, isn't it? To
exactly.
People have
that's true. But they'd like to say, oh well, but humans were different. Then, well, how are they different? They probably thought and acted exactly the same way we did. Only they had different technology, which we'd call primitive, but to them it wasn't. It was just, that was modern to them. If you had a stone spear, it's like, ooh, that's a nice stone spear. Where'd you get that? It was a.
Then you have a fight about the fact that you want that stone spear.
Exactly. Yeah. And also that they found that a lot of, there's an Israeli guy called Age Archaeology. He was like he wrote a great book. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a big thick book, and it's all about warfare from prehistory up to modern times. And in the book, he sort of found that a lot of prehistoric documented hunter-gatherer, like warfare and violence, was started simply by insults, someone insulting someone else, and then it'd escalate into, full-blown war, or someone stealing a pig or a cow or something. Just many reasons, I suppose, why the wars would have started. So anyway, I'm banging on about prehistoric warfare.
Love it.
It sounds a bit like Southampton on a Friday night.
Yeah,
I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, or Birkenhead, where I live.
Yeah.
So we've looked at warriors.
Yeah.
And we've touched on hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
When do we see evidence of really kind of settled existence?
Yeah.
So things like farming, kind of communal gatherings, trade, that kind of stuff.
I think probably around 5,000 BC, you start seeing proper farming settlements established in the Nile Valley. I mentioned the site before, Merimdi Beni Salama. That's a famous site, and they were full blown, farmers. They were growing crops, they were keeping cattle, sheep, goats, and although it was, the houses they lived in would have been quite simple, to our eyes. There would have been, wood huts, I suppose, with, I don't know, Nile reeds for the roof or whatever. But they found loads of artifacts as well, to show that they're quite sophisticated people. Stone axes, pottery ladles, bone harpoon points, various items of jewellery, these female figurines, which are intriguing, and we don't know what they were for. Could have just been toys, kids' toys, for all we know. Yeah. One of the most amazing finds was they found this preserved grain had been burnt, and it was just basically, it was perfectly preserved, apart from the fact it was black, obviously. But that showed they were growing crops as well. And, of course, they were still hunting, but that's when they definitely moved. I suppose it's the same in the European Neolithic, although that was probably a bit more gradual. They said, well, right, we're giving up the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. We're going to settle down and just stay in one place, I suppose, and farm, and supplement the diet with hunting as well. But it was, and there's a site called El Badari as well. That's around the same time. That's about 5,000 BC to 4,000 BC. And that's gives name to the Badarian culture. And they made pottery, really thin-walled pottery. It was like red burnished with a black top. And that pottery was never, ever, the thinness of the walls, it was never equaled by the potters in ancient Egyptian civilization. It was never equaled. And these are Neolithic, so-called quite primitive people.
Yeah.
You have Egyptian potters who, made some of the absolutely beautiful, pots and stuff, but they never could equal the fineness of the pottery walls. So,
What do you think is the standout find for pre-Pharaonic Egypt? The one you wish you'd found yourself? Is it the?
I think for me, I'm going to say Jebel Sahaba cemetery, the war cemetery. But that's just because I'm biased towards, prehistoric warfare. There's been so many. I suppose one of the most important finds was the Narmer pallet, which is this absolutely gorgeous. I think it's made out of mudstone. I can't remember the exact material. The stone pallet, and it's just got this beautiful carvings on it. One side there's a king, and this is just basic iconography of it. And on the other side there's this strange creature. It's like a cross between a leopard and a serpent. There's other things on it, like men with their heads chopped off, these fallen figures with their heads chopped off, and what looks like a fortified town. But the figure of the king, it features largest. He's the largest figure on the whole palette. And what they think, well, this is the sort of the traditional view of it, is it's a record of unification of Egypt at the end of sort of the, the 4th millennium, just before ancient Egyptian civilization emerged. This guy called King Narmer, he conquered Lower Egypt, so you got the, the Nile Delta, that area. He came up the river from Upper Egypt, and he unified Egypt and created, I suppose you could say, the first Egyptian state. Now, in recent years, Egyptologists they say, well, no, it's not a historical record. It's more to do with the iconography of kingship and mythological themes. But it's certainly, whether that's the case or not, what's on the part, again, it's recording warfare and conquest. And it is from around, I mean, I personally, I like the old idea, but this guy, King Narmer, someone said, well, he didn't even exist. But he is mentioned in the old king lists for Egypt, so he probably did. But that's a really important thing, because it like I said, it's like just before. And also what's interesting about it is like all the iconography on it is, it's echoed in later like temples and tombs of ancient Egypt, like particularly the image of the king who's shown with like smiting his enemies, which is such a famous scene on temple walls, that the pharaoh smiting his enemies. So the Carter culture, they were like the ones who sort of laid the foundations for a lot of the ideas that and the ideology, I suppose, it carried on over into ancient Egypt, early, the old kingdom, the first sort of dynasty of ancient Egypt. And I would love to have found, I mean, the Cave of Swimmers that I mentioned before. I mean, I've been to the Western Deserts, and it's just, it's an amazing place. I stayed there for a couple of the weekend, and to come across paintings that are, 6,000 years old or so, it must have been fantastic to find that. And I think in the future they'll probably, they'll probably find more. Well, I'm pretty sure they will, actually, because it's such a big place. And then, of course, you've got the Eastern Deserts as well, which hasn't been as well investigated, because I think it's more mountainous. But I'm sure there's sites there as well that they'll find. But for me, it's the war cemetery. Yeah, but it's so many. I mean, it really is. It's.
What would be the Holy Grail if you could find one thing?
Oh, right.
For you, never mind picking something that's great for like advancing the field in your warfare field, because we're military historians. So.
Oh well, I'd love to find another war cemetery. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah,
that'd be brilliant. But I think what would be a great find would be an Homo erectus, an early human burial. Just sort of that gives, just to show that it was Homo erectus, or even better, an even earlier hominid. Because, like I said, at the start of the podcast, I think personally the chances are that there were people, early humans in Egypt a lot longer, a lot earlier than we think. It's just that there's no evidence for it. That's the only trouble. So whether they'll ever find something like that, I suppose it's unlikely, but you never know. But yeah, I'd go for the war cemetery. And if another one was found, I mean, maybe like a Neolithic settlement that being attacked, when there was burials in the ditches and stuff like that you get in Europe, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
But
somehow I can imagine that if there was such a thing, then kind of decapitated people would feature quite heavily, because the theme all the way through this has just been people with their heads chopped off, people missing heads. Yeah,
they did like chopping heads off, that's for sure. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, let's see what the future brings. I mean, they're finding stuff all the time in Egypt, and I'm sure there'll be something interesting, really interesting gets found in the future, definitely. But I think to find an early human burial, not Homo sapiens, but a Homo erectus or even early, that'd be fantastic. Because at some point they've obviously moved out of sub-Saharan Africa and moved northwards, although some scholars would disagree. But I think the general sort of consensus is that we did emerge out of Africa, so that would be great. But yeah, either that or a war site. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, fingers crossed that you find something like that, and then you can come back and tell us all about it. But Julian, this has been brilliant. Your book, Egypt Before the Pharaohs, is out now. Folks can get it through the History Hack bookstore. Follow the link in the description, folks. Make sure you buy it, and thank you so much for enlightening us.
No problem. Thank you for having me. It was really nice to talk to you.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great